Welcome to God Chasers, a 6-part series on the aspect of discipleship and the Christian walk and what to do after you have responded to God's incredible love in your life. It's a follow-up series to something more, one that you can also find on this channel. But let's just jump right in. A few months ago, I had the opportunity, my wife and we went to the Sea of Galilee and over in Israel. It was a beautiful, beautiful place. And I recalled to mind this particular story where Peter and his brother Andrew, James, and John, they had been out fishing all night. And in the morning, they're putting their nets together, and Jesus comes up to where they are, and he says, I'd like to use your boat to preach in, because he had a crowd around him and he wanted to preach. Would you mind if I sit in here and you just push out a little bit, and I will preach to the people? Peter did what he was asked. Peter would always listen to Jesus because he had gotten to know him, and we'll see that here in a moment. But when Jesus is done, he gives a very unusual request to Peter. And we pick it up here in the book of Luke. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered him, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." Before we go further, this was a strange request because you don't fish in the Sea of Galilee during the day. The water's too clear and the fish see the nets. Peter could have simply responded, "I'll tell you what, you stick to preaching, Jesus, and I'll stick to fishing, and we'll both stay in our lanes and we'll do what we're good at." But Peter did what he was asked, and if he hadn't, he would have never experienced what came next. And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. An incredible outcome he would have never experienced if he hadn't done. But what would you do? I mean, you count the fish, you count the money you're going to make? No. Peter's response is something very unique and probably shocked everybody around. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. You thought you were good at fishing for actual fish? I'm going to train you, teach you, disciple you to be fishers of men. And so we have here one of the accounts of how Jesus called the disciples to him. And we're going to go back and revisit Peter and Andrew, James, and John here in a moment. But discipleship, the idea of a master, a rabbi, a teacher having students, pupils, learners, disciples, and imparting that wisdom, was nothing new to the Jewish people at the time. They were familiar with it. And we can trace the history back to actually Plato in Greece in the 4th century. He decided he wanted to impart the learning that he had onto some other individuals, so he went out to a field next to his house. It was actually called, ready for this, gymnasium. You've heard that term. And he picked the brightest and the smartest and the most intellectual and the ones that had the most promise, invited them to his house. The field next to his house was called Academy, named after Academus, a very prominent athletic figure there in Greece. So he invites them back to the house, and he starts teaching them, and he imparts this wisdom. And his most famous, you know the pairing, Aristotle. Plato, Aristotle, 20 years they had that relationship where Plato gave information to Aristotle, trained him, taught him, and imparted that wisdom. Aristotle then went and started his own school, and he called it a lyceum. And so here we have this aspect of this apprentice, this teaching, this imparting of information. And it's very crucial to understand why that is. We can go a little bit further into the Jewish tradition, and we recognize that the rabbi, he would also have disciples. But the difference is the rabbi would go find, just like Plato did, and pick the specific individuals that he wanted. Because again, the better you have and the better response, then you'll have more people that will come and want to have you choose them. And you get to choose from the best and pick of the litter. Well, again, this was not an unknown aspect of Jewish tradition. It was prominent. And we read here by R.T. France just how significant it was in the Jewish culture and why we understand when Jesus was calling his disciples what it meant. France writes, every Jewish teacher worth his salt had a circle of disciples who followed him, literally walking behind him as he rode or walked ahead, looked after his daily needs, and soaked up his teachings. Their teacher was the most important person in their lives. Again, the rabbi, there's 100 men. And he'd say, I'm going to find the best, the 10 or 12. And the rule of the small groups is that you don't want no more than 12, really, to impart the wisdom so you have that close relationship. And if he could find a class A scholar, intellectual, that he can impart his interpretation of the scriptures as they knew it at the time, what we call the Old Testament, and then he could therefore see that student become a very prominent rabbi, and he would say, I trained the best, and then more would be available for him to do. Now let's look at the difference with Jesus, because Jesus broke the mold. You would think you're a rabbi, you're a master, you go out and find the best and the brightest, but no, not Jesus. Jesus' approach is a little bit different. He said, he went with what his father told him to do. He said, I and my father are one, and I do what my father tells me to do. And he calls some very interesting individuals, which we'll look at here in a minute. But let's look at the account of the call. Let's look at one of them. We'll go to the book of John, chapter 1, 35 to 42. The next day, again, John was standing with two of the disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked by and said, Behold, the Lamb of God! The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, What are you seeking? And they said to him, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? He said to them, Come, and you will see. So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, We have found the Messiah, which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas. You notice, first of all, they kind of had a curiosity, and Jesus said, Well, come and see. Come and find out for yourself. Then Andrew is so intrigued by what's happening. What does he have to do? He has to go find his brother. And he said, You got to come and see this man. We have found the Messiah. You need to come. I've experienced him. I want you to come experience him as well. So the good news of who Jesus was spread from one to another. But it was followed by kind of an invitation. Come and see. By Jesus. And then by Andrew to Simon. Come and see. Now let's go on to Philip and the account of his call and what he did in response. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, Follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, We have found him of whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nathanael said to him, Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, Come and see. Here's Philip. He's met Jesus. He's experienced him. He goes to tell Nathanael. Nathanael has his doubts. But what is the response? Come and see. Come and see for yourself. Come and experience this for yourself. So he brings him. And now we have next the account of what happens when Jesus and Nathanael meet for the first time. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, How do you know me? Jesus answered him, Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. What do we have in these accounts? Jesus deliberately chose disciples, but he didn't choose what the rabbis of the Jewish tradition would choose. He didn't choose the best and the brightest, and we'll see that. He chose men that he knew were the ones he was supposed to call. He chose common men, not learned, common. And as he drew each one of them by an invitation, follow me, come and see, they in turn went and found somebody else. Andrew went and found Simon, who became Peter, Cephas the stone. And then Philip went and found Nathanael. They recognized something in Jesus, something unique. They recognized that promise. We found the Messiah, the one who's been written about in the book of Moses. And they responded in kind and invited somebody else. There were many who followed Jesus. There was a lot of people around that you could call disciples or followers, but there was only a core group of disciples, just a significant group of 12 that Jesus called. And we go to the book of Luke and we read this account of how Jesus did it and who specifically he called. In these days he went out in the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when the day came, he called the disciples and chose from them 12 whom he named apostles. Simon, who he named Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, also the sons of Zebedee, Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called a zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot who became a traitor. This is the group that Jesus called. He called common fishermen. James and John were known to have hotheads, tempers. They were called the sons of thunder. They were just vicious sometimes, very self-centered. Peter, he had foot and mouth disease. Philip, a little bit slow. Thomas, he was a doubter. That was his name, Thomas the Doubter. Then you have a zealot. Well, a zealot usually was a little bit on the fringes of what was going on in the Roman Empire, and they could draw attention to themselves. They were usually antagonistic. And then you have Judas, it says right here, the traitor. Jesus called somebody that he knew might possibly betray him, because there's no predestination as to who's saved and who's lost, so Jesus calls him with the hopes of reaching his heart. And here is this group of disciples, absolutely nothing like what a rabbi or Jewish teacher would call. They weren't the best, they weren't the brightest, but these were the individuals that Jesus decided, I'm going to pour myself into them for the next 3+ years. These are the men I'm going to invest myself into. Of those men, 11 of them were successfully taught, they were successfully ministered to, and they were trained for the gospel, and only one fell away. And then he was replaced later on, which we'll learn about. These were the men that Jesus would shape into God chasers. And we'll see more about what they were chasing and why as we go through this series over the next few sessions. And discipleship is what Jesus wants to do today. Discipleship is paramount and core to the Christian experience. It is core to relationship with Jesus. In fact, it is so important that before he ascended to heaven, Jesus drew the 11 disciples that were remaining. He brought them together. They went up to the mountain, and before he ascended, he gave them this commission. It's very famous in the Christian world, but it bears repeating because if Jesus said it as one of the last things he had to say before he left, it must be important. We find it in Matthew 28. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. That was what Jesus wanted them to do. It's a replicating process. All right, what Jesus is saying, look, I just spent 3+ years training, teaching, equipping, and pouring myself into you. Now you go and you find disciples and you do the same thing for them. You recreate this process. You replicate what has happened in you. You do so in somebody else. It's believing, it's modeling, and it's teaching. It's replicating Christ from one person to another and drawing into that close personal relationship with him. The discipleship does something unique. It draws people closer to God and to each other as they're working together. And I really like, as we focus on this aspect of discipleship and really how it meshes with Christianity today, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who lived in Germany in the beginning of the 20th century and was actually killed for defying the orders of Hitler. He was killed in one of the concentration camps. He talks about this aspect of what we're facing in the world today in Christianity and discipleship, how the two are not mixing as they ought to, and what happens when it doesn't. Because again, Jesus said discipleship is one of the most important things. It's the most important thing, really, in the Great Commission. And why is it that today in the Christian church it's being missed so often when it really ought to be the most important thing that we do as a church? And it's the most important thing in your life as you've accepted God as the one who can give you the life that you've always looked for, that something more. So I want to share with you from Dietrich Bonhoeffer from his book, The Call to Discipleship. Discipleship means adherence to Christ, and because Christ is the object of the adherence, it must take the form of discipleship. An abstract Christology, a doctrinal system, a benign religious knowledge on the subject of grace or on the forgiveness of sin, render disciples superfluous, and in fact they positively exclude any idea of discipleship whatever, and are essentially detached to the whole conception of following Christ. With an abstract idea, it is possible to enter into a relationship of formal knowledge, to become enthusiastic about it, and perhaps even to put it into practice, but it can never be followed in personal obedience. Christianity without the living Christ is inevitably Christianity without discipleship. And Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ. And I would venture to say that this is probably what is missing from Christianity most often today, is the disciple process, this aspect of going and replicating disciples. See, we get believers. We say, will you accept Christ as your Savior? And yes. But Jesus doesn't want to just take you as you are. He wants to create something different and better and grow you in the process. It's discipleship. It's a changed life. It's a reflection of looking like Jesus. You know the name Christian? You know what that's from? Little Christ. That's what they were called. Little Christ. How would you like to be known as a little Christ as you've accepted God and all that He has to give you? We accept, but we're not changed, and that's part of what the discipleship process has to pertain to. Bill Hall is perhaps, he's since passed away, but he is perhaps one of the most affluent writers, and he really has given a great authority on discipleship, how it relates to the church, and the importance of why we need discipleship, why why discipleship is so crucial to us and the growth of us as individuals and also as the church. Unfortunately, non-discipleship Christianity dominates much of the thinking of the contemporary church. In addition to sucking the strength from the church, Christianity without discipleship causes the church to assimilate itself into the culture. And sadly, whenever the difference between the church's and culture's definition of morality ceases to exist, the church loses its power and authority. And I think Bill Hall has summed up what the issues are with Christianity today. The world is looking for some certainty, moral certainty even. We have racism, crime, war. We have all sorts of things that are rampant. And they look for the church, they look for certainty because the church, aren't we supposed to best represent God to the world? And they look at Christians, they look at me, they look at others, and they say, give us a word of certainty. But they look at our characters, they look at the way we live, and they say, but are you really growing closer to Christ? Are you any different than us? I mean, do you watch the same things we watch? Do you read the same things we read? Do you do the same things that we do? And they're seeing a difference that is not that great. It's not a high contrast Christian. It is just basically shades of gray. And this discipleship is what we need in the church today. It's what God has called us to. It's what Jesus commanded the disciples. Go make more disciples. It's what He's calling you to. He's calling you to become a disciple and to also make disciples, to grow in Him. What is discipleship really? I mean, if you really wanted to boil it down to its essence, what would it be? And I think Paul writes it very efficiently here in 1 Corinthians. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. That's discipleship. You follow Jesus, and then you have others follow you because you are following the example of Christ and you're reflecting Christ because you can't help but grow into looking like Jesus if you're a disciple. Discipleship is so important that it's mentioned in most translations 269 times in the New Testament. As a comparison, believers used twice, Christian is used twice. So discipleship is God's method of growth. It's taking this belief, I believe in God, I believe in Christ, I believe in salvation, and it's translating this belief into an action. I shared a story in the Something More series. Blondin used to travel back and forth on a tightrope across the Niagara Falls back in the 19th century. He comes across on an empty wheelbarrow and says, does anyone believe that I could take a person in this wheelbarrow? And they all raise their hand. Who wants to get in? And nobody would get in. Discipleship is not just raising your hand and saying, I believe. It's actually getting in the wheelbarrow and letting that be accomplished into your life. J. Oswald Sanders speaks to the deficit of discipleship today in the church. And it's so core, it's so needed. But he speaks to that deficit and really what it's doing to the church, what it's doing in individuals. Today, one may be regarded as Christian, even if there are few, if any, signs of progress in discipleship. The temper of our times is for instant gratification and short-term commitment, quick answers to prayer, and quick results with the minimum effort and discomfort. There's no such thing as easy and instant discipleship. One can commence a walk of discipleship in a moment, but the first step must lengthen into a lifelong walk. And there's discipleship. It's a lifelong journey. It's raising your hand, and Blondin says, can anyone imagine me taking a person in the wheelbarrow? Oh, yes, yes. And then it's actually getting into the wheelbarrow to let Blondin do it. God says, I can transform you. So yes, I believe that salvation is for me. I believe you can transform me. And then Jesus says and welcomes you to this relationship of discipleship because He wants to transform you. He wants to continue that process in you. And discipleship is a response to God's amazing love. Just like those disciples, as they responded to Jesus, follow me. You know that initial story of Peter, Andrew, James, and John? They had already knew who Jesus was. They had already kind of been thinking about being disciples, but they still weren't sure. They still weren't for certain. And that's when Peter, when he fell down at Jesus' feet, when he saw what Jesus had done with the fish, he was overwhelmed by who Jesus was and says, I can't be around you. But he responded by leaving everything anyways. That's what he wants from us. He wants this wholehearted commitment. But he doesn't just say, come follow me. He gives you an invitation to something that's better than what you might have right now. This invitation we find in the book of Matthew, chapter 11. We're going to reflect on it different times throughout the next few sessions. But let's focus in on it now as Jesus invites me to something amazing. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He's inviting us to learn, disciple, to learn, to share, to have his experience become ours. It's an open invitation. He's calling you, he's calling me to this lifelong journey of discipleship here on earth that translates to an amazing relationship for eternity. But you say, well, why should I consider it? What Jesus is saying, look, take my yoke. We'll reflect on that more, what that means. But also, my burden is easy. I mean, you are under enormous burden, life. But I want to give you something better. As we wrap it up, A.W. Tozer, one of my favorite authors, he takes this particular text and he gives his perspective on it. Here we have two things standing in contrast to one another, a burden and a rest. The burden is not a local one peculiar to those first hearers, but one which is borne by the whole human race. It consists not of political oppression or poverty or hard work. It is far deeper than that. It is felt by the rich as well as the poor, for it is something from which wealth and idleness can never deliver us. We might be tempted to think, man, they live in a beautiful house. These celebrities, these millionaires, these billionaires, they've got everything. But when you strip everything away, we all face the same issues. We want to be loved. We want to be free. We want to be accepted. We want to be happy. We want to have pure joy. And this invitation doesn't matter if you're rich, you're poor, if you have a home, if you're homeless, if you're healthy, if you're not, if you're wealthy, doesn't matter. The burdens we face that the world puts on us, that Satan wants to put on us, we all have the same thing. And Christ's invitation is the same for each one of us. It's a invitation to grow, to be found in him and to learn. A.W. Tozer, he goes on a little bit further and he says, what are these burdens? What do we face? That all of us uniquely may be in our own aspects of life, but we all share these in common, these burdens. What are they? The burdens borne by mankind is a heavy and crushing thing. The word Jesus used means a load carried or toil borne to the point of exhaustion. Rest is simply release from that burden. It is not something we do. It is something that comes to us when we cease to do. And there you go. Jesus' invitation, the same today as it was 2,000 years ago. I'll give you rest. You can learn from me. I will teach you. I will impart everything I have to you so that you can in turn impart what you have learned to others and say, come and see. What would it take to answer this? Only you know. And over the next few sessions, we're going to talk about this together here in this series, The God Chasers. And maybe when you're done, you will determine that knowing God is one thing, but chasing after him is quite something else.